Hello, this is one of the most horrifying cases that ever took place in Shenyang. At the time, the case was deliberately concealed and not widely publicized, so very few people knew about it. Between 1992 and 1995, a total of 13 people were killed, and one victim was left severely injured. What made this case even more terrifying was the sheer brutality of the perpetrator. Not only did he violate the victims after their deaths, but he also committed unspeakable acts, such as dismembering bodies, removing organs, and taking parts of their corpses. If the victim was a young and beautiful woman, he would go as far as cutting flesh from the thighs and buttocks to roast and eat. These crimes were as gruesome, almost the most notorious cases of cannibalism in Chinese history. But what turned him into such a monster? What kind of life had he lived? Liu Xiaogang was born into a warm and happy family of 4 in Shenyang. His father was a well-educated man who graduated from a prestigious university and worked at a high-voltage switch factory, earning a stable income. Because of this, their family lived in comfort and bought. Xiaogang sibling received top-tier education. However, this peaceful life did not last long. In the mid-1960s, his father was accused of being a counter-revolutionary, a grave charge at the time. This not only plunged the family into financial hardship, but also delivered a devastating emotional blow to the mall at the time. Xiaogang was only 11 years old. He could not understand why his kin and devoted father was being humiliated, tied up, and forced to wear a pointed dunce cap while being publicly denounced. That scene etched itself into his mind, shaping his personality into one filled with extremism and hatred. The relentless mental torment and public shame eventually drove his father insane, turning the family's life into a nightmare. 1974, Xiaogang was sent to a sheep farm in Panjing for education through labor. He worked tirelessly, hoping to shed the label of traitor on that society had branded him with. Through his relentless efforts, she was eventually allowed to return to the city and even secured a job at the very factory where his father had once worked. When Xiaogang as released after his time in prison, he believed that things would change, that life would finally stabilize, and that a brighter future lay ahead. But reality was nothing like he had hoped. Though his father had been exonerated and his reputation restored, his health had deteriorated beyond repair. The man Xiaogang was now a frail and senile shadow of his former self, unable to work or contribute to the family anymore. This transformation left a deep wound in Xiaogang's heart. The injustice his father suffered and his own sense of abandonment, gradual light, turned him into a man consumed by resentment towards society. Determined to reclaim his father's lost dignity, he threw himself into his work, striving to climb the social ladder. However, no matter how hard he tried, the highest position he could attain was that of amateur team leader, a role far beneath his aspiration. She had always believed he was capable of much more, that he could even become a county magistrate. These internal conflicts, his father's suffering, and his growing dissatisfaction with society distorted his values over time. Eventually, he adopted a extreme belief: Amon's name should be remembered in life, just as a bird's cry should be heard in the sky. If I cannot achieve greatness and be immortalized in history, then I will embrace infamy. Even if I become the villain, at least my name will not be forgotten. This twisted ideology led him down the path of crime. The turning point in 1983, Xiaogang and a group of accomplices began stealing copper from the factory where he worked. The theft was quickly discovered, and he was arrested. To everyone's surprise, he voluntarily took full responsibility for a crime, hoping to portray himself as a righteous man, a fearless and honorable figure in the eyes of those around him. But his plan backfired. Instead of admiration, he received a severe punishment: 5 years of re-education. Through labor, his attempt to win respect had ultimately cost him his freedom. During his years in the labor camp, he realized that his actions had only led to suffering and loss. Determined to turn his life around, he became a model prisoner, working diligently to earn an early release. His efforts paid off, and he was granted parole ahead of Shi Du upon returning to the factory. Liu Xiaogang had changed somewhat. His time in prison had made him more composed and mature. He worked hard and was soon promoted to team leader, becoming an essential worker in the production line. Had he stayed on this path, perhaps his life would have taken a different, better course: the descent into darkness. However, life is rarely a smoothest one. Hopes everything changed when Xiaogang discovered poker gambling addiction he could not resist. He became obsessed, convinced that his intelligence would allow him to win big. But reality proved otherwise. Every time he played, he lost, and every loss only fueled his determination to gamble even more. Before long, his entire family's life savings at the gambling table. His wife pleaded with him, repeatedly begging him to quit. But Xiaogang was beyond reason. He failed to realize that with every bet he lost, there was not just losing money, he was destroying his own future and the happiness of his family. After years of struggling to salvage their marriage, his wife finally gave up. She filed for divorce, leaving him alone in the vast Farrant City from that moment on, Liu Xiaogong spiraled into self-destruction. Every time he received his salary, he would head straight to the gambling den, playing until he had lost every last penny before dragging himself home. In despair, of course, life was never that easy. As his money slowly ran out, began looking for other ways to fund his gambling addiction. Gang decided to take a risk, stealing copper from the factory where he worked, hoping that the money would allow him to continue down his destructive path. But as the old saying goes, the more you walk in the dark, the more likely you are to encounter a ghost one day. He was caught red-handed in the act. This time, he was not only detained for 3 months, but also lost this job, his last lifeline. He had no face left to show to anyone. But instead of blaming himself, he shifted all the blame on others. She convinced himself that someone had set them up, that his downfall was the result of a conspiracy. What angered him the most was the fact that he was arrested for handling 12 kilograms of stolen goods, because in his mind it was utterly unfair. The situation he found himself in was difficult to accept according to the law. 12 kilograms was just enough to warrant a criminal charge, but he had always been meticulous. Every time he stole, he ensured the weight never exceeded 11 kilograms, just enough to avoid a severe penalty, ensuring that even if he was caught, they would only face administrative fine. But his time had somehow become 12 kilogram gang was certain that someone had deliberately set them up, and this only fueled his resentment, consumed by had he starting revenge. The people he despised the most were these security guards who had caught them. He fantasized about killing them. First, to vent this anger, his rage drove him to recklessness, and he gradually lost control over himself. One night, after losing everything in a gambling den, an even darker thought crept into his mind: murdering someone for money. For a long time, he had been keeping an Nazmall convenience store in a residential neighborhood. The shop was always busy, which meant a steady stream of income. Zheng knew that the store owners must have a substantial amount of cash. On the night of January 21st, 1992, had decided to put his plan into action. He quietly broke into the stores, swiftly killed the husband and wife who owned it, and stole 2 savings books, 4 cartons of cigarettes, and 1,000 yuan in cash. The act of killing left a deep impression on him. After committing the murders, Gang was overwhelmed with panic, lived in constant fear, convinced that the police would catch him at any moment. However, after a few days passed with no sign of an investigation, he gradually relaxed. He believed he had successfully gotten away with it once he felt safe. He used the stolen money to continue gambling. The thrill of taking lives without consequence acted as a drug, pushing him further down his twisted path. He began to harbor a deep pat red for the wealthy, blaming society for never giving him Ariel chance. His disappointment and rage festered inside him, making him increasingly violent. On day in 1996, after stealing a sum of money, Gang unexpectedly ran into an old cow worker. Maydang. Years ago, after a gambling loss, Gang had borrowed 400 yuan from Maydang, promising to return it within a few days. However, half a year had passed, and he had made no effort to repay her. Maydang had tried to collect the debt multiple times, but Gang always evaded her. Eventually, she had no choice but to confront him at his home. She had demanded her money, but instead of apologizing or explaining, Gang reacted with hostility. When Maydang mocked him with a few sharp words, his rage exploded. At moment he made up his mind, he would teach her a lesson. A few days later, on an ordinary morning, Gang rode his bicycle to Maydang's house. She had no reason to suspect anything and warmly invite. Dim inside, however, as soon as she saw the gold bracelet on her wrist, his eyes lit up. The gleam of the gold burned into his mind, igniting a fire that consumed all logic. Overcome with greed and fury, he brutally murdered Maydang in cold blood. But even after taking her life, his rage did not subside. In a twisted frenzy, he removed her clothing and committed a heinous act of defilement. Perhaps in his sick mind, this act of control over her lifeless body was the only way to soothe his own anger. Only after fulfilling his horrific urges did he feel some measure of satisfaction. This cruelty didn't end thereafter. Taking 1,000 tons yuan in cash and the gold bracelet from her wrist, Gang calmly left the scene without bothering to erase any evidence. This was more than just another murder. It marked a turning point in his descent into madness. He had fully embraced the monstrous side of himself. From that moment on, his mind was forever altered. Gang had become a true psychopath, his twisted thoughts spiraling further into darkness. Murder was no longer just an act of violence, it became a necessity. The pleasure he derived from taking lives created an endless cycle that could not escape. Each crime fueled his growing bloodlust, pushing him to commit even greater atrocities. With every new murder, he felt a sick satisfaction. He found joy in the suffering of his victims. Killing was no longer just about stealing or seeking revenge. It had become an addiction and a replaceable part of his existence. He continued his spree, with each crime becoming more brutal than the last. In May 1998, Gang broke into a house near the long-distance bus station in Shenyang City. The homeowner, Madame Jubicam, His next victim after violating her, he threatened her, demanding that she reveal the location of her valuables. When she refused to cooperate, Hilo stole patients without hesitation. He gouged out their eyes, leaving her screaming in agony before mercilessly ending her life, along with that of her young child. Despite his escalating brutality, the murders were no longer enough to satisfy him. He wanted more. That was when he made a fateful decision. He would no longer act alone. Gang began to pull his younger brother Li into his crimes. Liang, 4 years, worked at a high-pressure valve factory in Shen City, but he was far from innocent. Liang was an alcoholic, had an obsession with women, and was known for his violent temper without Gang's influence. Liang might never have dared to commit such horrific crimes, but once he was pulled into the abyss, his true nature was revealed. In some ways, she was even more ruthless than his older brother. Over the following months, the two brothers carried out a series of murders, robberies, and sexual assaults in the districts of West Iron and Yuhuang in Shen City. Gang cunning Sev meticulously planned each attack. He would scout locations, choose the perfect time to strike, and use tactics like tailing his victims or laying an ambush before breaking in. Meanwhile, his younger brother Liang would drink himself into a stupor before each crime, using alcohol to numb his fear and unleash his inner monster when facing their victims. Liang did not stop at rape. He committed horrifying, unspeakable acts that shook the community. He would cut open the victims, bodies mutilating their chests. If the victim was a young, beautiful woman with fair skin and a full figure, he would take things even further, carving meat from her thighs or buttocks to bring home and cook as food. On March 12, 1999, the Li brothers broke into the home of an old enemy, Mr. Jia. However, Jia was not home that night, so they turned their attention to his wife, Mrs. Sun. Ignoring her desperate pleas for mercy, they ruthlessly murdered both her and her young child. They then cut a piece of flesh from Sun's buttocks and took it home to fry and eat. Their depravity did not stop there. Before leaving, they stole 500 yuan, a credit card, and a savings book worth 1,000 yuan. As if their crimes were not enough, they left behind a chilling threat for Jia Wu. Next, Jia reported the crime to the police, but without any concrete information on Gang. The brothers remained free a few days later. Gang went to the bank to withdraw money. Using the stolen savings book, he successfully made 2 transactions, withdrawing a total of 908 yuan. However, during the second transaction, he noticed a surveillance camera mounted on the wall. Realizing the danger, he broke out in a cold sweat and immediately ordered his younger brother to stop everything. But by then, Liang had spiraled too deep into madness with his twisted and uncontrollable urges. He ignored his brother's warning and continued his gruesome spree. A series of horrific crimes left the entire city paralyzed with fear. The local police force had no choice but to assemble a special task force to track down the culprits. Based on crime scene analysis and the patterns of the attacks, investigators conclude that the same perpetrator or group was responsible. However, with limited forensic technology at the time, they could not yet identify the suspects. Despite linking the case together, a major breakthrough on May 2, 1999, a new murder case shook Tis District. A private business owner, Zhang, was found brutally slain. As the police investigated, they discovered that Zhang had been closely associated with a suspicious man. The special task force brought in a forensic sketch artist to reconstruct the suspect's face. Following the clues, it took only 10 days before police identified their main suspect, Liang. It turned out that Zhang bin Liang's former live-in girlfriend. When she discovered the full extent of his brutality, she used the information to blackmail him. Enraged, Liang murdered her, but in doing so, he left behind the one clue that would ultimately lead to his downfall. When arrested, Liang showed no remorse. He openly confessed to killing Zhang and admitted to participating in a series of robberies, rapes, and murders. According to him, a total of 9 victims had been killed across 8 different cases, including the murder of Deng Mei on March 12th. His shocking confession became the key turning point in the investigation, uncovering critical leads. However, just as the police prepared to widen the case and track down his accomplices, Liang suddenly fell silent, determined to protect his older brother. He chose to end his own life in prison with Liang dead. The case seemed to reach a dead discovery. As detectives reviewed Liang's statements, they uncovered a crucial detail. After Deng Mei's murder, her savings account had been emptied. The police decided to retrieve all surveillance footage from the bank. The video showed a man withdrawing money at the counter. His facial features closely matched witness descriptions to locate the suspect as quickly as possible. The police released his portrait through media channels, broadcasting a nationwide warrant and offering a cash reward despite the meticulous efforts. Gang seemed to have vanished into thin air upon seeing his face on the news. Gang realized his time was running out. He swift fled from Shenyang and prepared for his final desperate plan to destroy all security systems at the high-voltage power plant, where he once worked, wiping away any last traces of his existence. But fate had other plans. Just as she was executing his scheme, his presence was discovered as security guard at the plant. Recognized Gang from the wanted posters and immediately alerted the authorities. The police soon confirmed Athy was indeed the man caught in the bank's surveillance footage with the suspect's identity. Confirmed law enforcement launched a massive city-wide manhunt. After 9 relentless days, they finally captured Liu Xiao Gang. Ashi hid in a remote area on the outskirts of the city at the police station upon learning of his younger brother's suicide. Gang abandoned all resistance. He confessed to everything since 1992. And his brother had carried out a wave of horrific crimes across Heping, Che, and Yuhong districts. The two had murdered 13 people and left one seriously injured for his unforgivable atrocities. Liu Xiao Gang was sentenced to death on April 25, 2001. He was led to the execution ground, where justice was finally served. The execution of the Liu brothers marked the end of 5 years of terror in Shenyang.